It's a story that has it all. Danger, tragedy, intrigue, epic battles, child murder, a 12-year-old bride who became a 13-year-old widow and mother, and ultimately the woman who won the Wars of the Roses. I'm speaking, of course, about the life of Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, and someone who, as a little girl, was the pawn of her much more influential male relations, but who ultimately rose to become the most powerful woman in England. It's an incredible tale, and Margaret is one of history's savviest fighters, greatest survivors, and a personal favourite of mine. So sit back and relax with History Calling as I tell you the story of the real Red Queen. Before we get going, this video is part of a larger series on the Wars of the Roses, and especially on the women involved in those wars, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you. It includes biographies of ladies such as Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, Queen Margaret of Anjou, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and her mother Jacquetta of Luxembourg, with more still to come. If you enjoy my content, please remember to hit the subscribe button under this video and switch on the notification bell so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find me on Instagram and Patreon, both of which are linked in the description box below. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May 1443, the only surviving child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his wife Margaret Beauchamp or Beauchamp of Bletsoe, and as such she was part of the sprawling Plantagenet family, which was then the ruling dynasty in England. Through her father, Margaret was a great-great-granddaughter of Edward III, and it was this trickle of royal blood which would give her, and ultimately her son, a vague claim on the English throne, and lead to the House of Tudor taking the crown. It was a complicated descent, though, as it rested on an absolutely scandalous marriage, the children of which were initially illegitimate. I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining it to you here, as the story of Edward III's sons and some of his grandchildren is at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. If you're not familiar with that conflict, which was actually a whole series of conflicts spanning several generations, it was the dispute between different branches of the Plantagenet family over who should hold the throne, and it would shape Margaret's life and indeed English history. Edward III had 5 surviving sons, but by the time he died in 1377, his eldest, Edward Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, was already dead. The throne therefore went to the prince's son, who became Richard II, and by the way, the yellow lines indicate marriages and the blue lines indicate offspring here. Richard had no children, and according to the rules of primogeniture, his heir was Edmund, Earl of March, who was a descendant of Edward III's second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence. However, in 1399, Richard II was deposed by his first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster. I know it's a lot, you can always re-listen to this section of the video if you need to. Bolingbroke became Henry IV, and Richard II died soon afterwards, by which I mean he was probably murdered. Henry IV's eldest son became Henry V, then his son, by the French princess Catherine of Valois, became Henry VI in 1422 at the age of just 9 months. This is the man who was on the throne when Margaret was born. But as this branch of the Plantagenets were descended from Edward III's third son, their blood claim on the throne was arguably weaker than the descendants of his second son, Lionel of Antwerp. Lionel's descendant, Edmund, Earl of March, was long dead and had had no children, but he had passed his claim to the throne to his sister, Anne Mortimer. She had married her distant cousin, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, who, just to confuse things, was also a descendant of Edward III, this time through his fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. We'll come back to this branch of the family later on, for it produced Edward IV and Richard III among others, but for now, what's important to remember is that we have the descendants of John of Gaunt, who are known as the Lancastrians because he was the Duke of Lancaster, and we have the descendants of Lionel of Antwerp and Edmund of Langley, who are known as the Yorks because Edmund was Duke of York. The Lancastrians hold the throne at the time of Margaret's birth because Henry IV had seized it, but the Yorks have a better blood claim on it because they are descended from an older son of Edward III. The idea of roses comes from the fact that one of the badges sometimes used by the House of Lancaster was a red rose, while one of the badges sometimes used by the House of York was a white rose. Margaret has therefore gained the moniker of the Red Queen because, as you're about to see, she was a Lancastrian. Now for the tricky bit. Yes, we haven't even reached the tricky bit yet. How does Margaret fit into all of this? For that, we need to go back to John of Gaunt. I've told you that his heir was his son Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, but he wasn't John's only child, far from it in fact. After the death of John's first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, he married again in 1371 to Constance of Castile. They had no surviving sons, so Constance isn't going to come into our story very much at all, except to say that John cheated on her, prolifically, with his mistress, Catherine Swynford. John and Catherine produced 3 sons and a daughter between 1372 and 1381, the eldest of which was Margaret's grandfather, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. Now these children were 100% illegitimate and therefore had no claim on the throne. However, the waters were muddied after Constance died in 1394, for John of Gaunt now took the opportunity to marry his mistress in 1396 in one of the most scandalous unions in English royal history. This still didn't make their pre-existing children legitimate, but the Duke took the additional step of getting the then Pope to recognise the marriage in 1397 and retroactively make its children legitimate. Now this is bonkers, of course. Those kids were definitely born outside wedlock, which is the whole definition of illegitimate, but it just goes to show the degree to which money and power can buy people out of having to follow the rules. This legitimacy was further bolstered by an act of the English Parliament that same year, but in 1407, with Henry Bolingbroke now on the throne, the act legitimising his half-siblings was further clarified, and a clause was added which specifically said that they and their descendants were barred from inheriting the crown. Margaret's father was born in 1404 and married her mother in about 1442. Sources differ on the exact year. Margaret was their only surviving child, and so when her father died in 1444, possibly by his own hand after a series of military and financial failures, this baby, who was the daughter of the king's half-cousin, became a valuable heiress, albeit one with no legal claim on the throne. Within days of her father's death, Margaret was placed under the guardianship of royal favourite William de la Pole, Earl, later Duke of Suffolk, who married her off in early 1450 when she was just 6 years old to his 7-year-old son, John de la Pole. You don't generally hear much about this so-called marriage when you learn about Margaret, because it was dissolved in 1453, and as it was an annulment of an unconsummated child marriage made before she was 12 years old, which was the minimum age a girl could marry and cohabit with her husband in this era, it was arguably never really a marriage to begin with. Margaret herself didn't recognise it as a real union, but there's enough of a grey area given the state of marital laws at the time that you could, if you really wanted to, argue that little John de la Pole was her first husband. During this time, little Margaret remained in her mother's care and grew up with the half-siblings produced through the Dowager Duchess of Somerset's earlier and later marriages. After Suffolk, who was deeply unpopular with many English nobles, was murdered in 1450, her guardianship was up for grabs again, and in 1453 it was transferred to the half-brothers of the king, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Like the Beauforts, these two men were the product of another controversial marriage, this time between a royal mother and a commoner father. I've already explained to you that Henry VI was the son of Henry V and the French princess Catherine of Valois. Well, after the death of her husband, Catherine secretly married a Welshman named Owen Tudor, and that union produced Edmund and Jasper. Now in 1453, these two gained control of little Margaret and of the Beaufort estates she had inherited. That wasn't all, though. In 1455, pretty much as soon as she turned 12, Margaret was married to Edmund, who was the Earl of Richmond and in his mid-20s. She was now the king's sister-in-law as well as his cousin, and unlike her earlier child marriage, this one was consummated, as Edmund sought to produce an heir as fast as possible and with a shocking disregard for the physical well-being of his extremely young wife. Now Countess of Richmond, she and her husband travelled to Wales in late 1455 and set up home in Llanthony in Pembrokeshire. Margaret conceived around the end of April 1456, when she was still about a month shy of her 13th birthday, but Edmund would never live to see their child. Having been captured by Yorkist forces in August 1456 and imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle, he caught the plague and died on the 1st of November, leaving Margaret a very young and pregnant widow. She moved to Pembroke Castle, home of her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor, who was Earl of Pembroke by the way, and there on the 28th of January 1457 she gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Henry after his half-uncle the king, but the birth was apparently difficult, particularly given Margaret's youth and small stature, and it seems very likely that it permanently damaged her, as despite 2 further marriages there is no evidence that she ever conceived again. Still, no one knew that she couldn't have more children in 1457, and in any case she still held the valuable Beaufort estates and was once again a sought-after bride. Less than a year after Henry Tudor's birth, in January 1458, his now 14-year-old mother was married again, this time to her distant cousin Henry Stafford, who was the son of Humphrey, Duke of Buckingham, and a descendant of Edward III's 5th son, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. Again, there was a huge age gap, as Stafford was in his early 30s at the time. Not very long afterwards, the Wars of the Roses began to seriously impinge upon Margaret's life. Henry VI had proven to be a very weak king, not to mention one who had serious mental health issues. At the time that his wife, Margaret of Anjou, had given birth to their only child, Edward, Prince of Wales, back in 1453, King Henry had been in a catatonic state, from which he had only emerged at the end of 1454. For almost a year, while the king was completely incapacitated, the country had been managed by his cousin Richard, Duke of York, who held the post of protector and defender of the realm. This man was a descendant of Edward III's 2nd and 4th sons, you may remember, and had a stronger blood claim on the throne than Henry VI. He was also second in line after the young Prince of Wales. There was another protectorate between late 1455 and February 1456, and relations between the Yorks and the Lancastrians continued to deteriorate as the decade progressed. In June 1459, York and his supporters were indicted for treason, and hostilities quickly broke out. I'm not going to run through every individual battle here, as not all of them directly affected Margaret, but from her point of view, the first really important clash came on the 10th of July 1460, when her father-in-law, the Duke of Buckingham, was killed at the Battle of Northampton. As a result of this Yorkist victory, Henry VI was taken prisoner, Margaret of Anjou and her son had to flee north to Scotland, and on the 31st of October, Parliament passed an Act of Accord stating that the throne would pass from Henry VI to the Duke of York, not to the Prince of Wales. It was a disaster for the Lancastrian cause. Still, all was not lost, for events moved at breakneck speed over the next few months, and at various points it seemed like either York or Lancaster could be victorious. The Duke of York went from being almost king at the end of October 1460 to being killed on the battlefield at Wakefield on the 30th of December that year. Then Margaret of Anjou, who had picked up Scottish support for her cause, marched back into England in January 1461. She headed for London, while she and Margaret Beaufort's brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, and his father, Owen Tudor, clashed with the forces of the Duke of York's eldest surviving son, Edward, Earl of March, at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross at the start of February. It was another huge setback for the Lancastrians and the Tudors alike. Owen Tudor was killed, and Jasper was forced to flee to mainland Europe. Although Queen Margaret did succeed in freeing her husband from Yorkist forces at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February, the royal family and their rowdy and destructive army were refused entry into London by its citizens. Instead, they had to retreat back north as the forces of Edward, Earl of March, approached the capital, and on the 26th of February he was allowed into the city, where he was proclaimed King Edward IV on the 4th of March. The Lancastrian royals made a last-ditch effort to reverse these losses at the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March, but they lost to the Yorks and had to flee to Scotland, then mainland Europe. But what did this all mean for Margaret? Well, she and her husband were devoted Lancastrians, as she was the cousin and sister-in-law of Henry VI and had been married into the Tudor family. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, fought for the Lancastrians at Towton, and when they lost, things could have gone very badly for him and his wife. Fortunately, they were both pardoned by the new Edward IV, and Margaret's lands were not forfeited. What was taken from her, however, was her 4-year-old son. Little Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was stripped of his title and inheritance and placed under the guardianship of William Lord Herbert, who captured Jasper Tudor's home, Pembroke Castle, on the 30th of September 1461. Indeed, Herbert himself was now made the new Earl of Pembroke, even though Jasper still lived. This forced separation from her son was surely nothing but painful for Margaret, especially as it became clear she would have no more children, but there was nothing that could be done about it. She was allowed to write to Henry and visit him sometimes, but she was powerless to do much else. The Lancastrian position was only weakened further when Henry VI was recaptured in 1465 and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In 1469, Lord Herbert, or Lord Pembroke as he was now, and Henry Tudor were ordered to go with the king to fight the forces of Edward's rebellious cousin, the Earl of Warwick, and his brother George, Duke of Clarence, at the Battle of Edgecote on the 24th or 26th of July. This is another one of those dates where the sources differ. The king and his men were defeated, the former Lord Herbert was executed, and Edward IV was taken prisoner and initially sent here to Warwick Castle. Margaret panicked when she heard all that had happened, thinking that her child might have been killed or injured too, but the 12-year-old Henry Tudor had been taken back to his guardian's widow, Anne Devereux. A new guardian would be needed for him though, and Margaret tried to negotiate with the Duke of Clarence to improve her son's position and perhaps get some of his lands back. This misfired when Edward IV managed to regain the initiative in the autumn of 1469, for it now looked as though Margaret had been consulting with his enemies. Fortunately, her husband's loyalty was considered secure enough that nothing happened to her as a result of this, but it certainly did nothing to endear her to the Yorkist cause. In the yo-yo world of the Wars of the Roses, though, Edward IV's return to power didn't last particularly long. Though he at first made a public show of forgiving Warwick and Clarence, relations between the two sides quickly broke down again, and the latter two men ended up fleeing to France, where they made an alliance with the exiled Margaret of Anjou, then returned to England to try to oust Edward once more. He was in the north of the country when they landed, and as such was taken by surprise and unable to defend his capital. He fled to Holland while his pregnant wife, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and their children took shelter in Westminster Abbey. Henry VI was released from his imprisonment and put back on the throne in October 1470. Margaret was now back in royal good books. Her brother-in-law/cousin was king once again, and her other brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, was back in England too. Her son was brought from where he had been staying at Webley with Anne Devereux to his uncle Jasper at Hereford in October 1470, and from there they travelled to London where mother and child were reunited. They met and dined with the king, who supposedly, according to much later sources, said that his nephew would one day be king. The family stayed together until the 11th of November, when the now 13-year-old Henry Tudor left Margaret to go to Wales with Jasper. Margaret now negotiated with the Duke of Clarence again to have her son's title of Earl of Richmond, which Clarence was in possession of, returned to him upon the Duke's death. But all these plans came to naught when Edward IV returned to reclaim his kingdom. This happened in March 1471, when Edward landed in Yorkshire with his other brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. Clarence defected from Warwick back to his brothers, and Edward marched to and entered London unopposed, rescuing his wife, daughters, and newborn son from sanctuary in Westminster Abbey — this baby was one of the future princes in the Tower, by the way — then set about eliminating Lancastrian opposition. Henry VI was re-imprisoned in the Tower of London as Edward retook the throne, and on the 14th of April the Earl of Warwick's forces were defeated at the Battle of Barnet in Hertfordshire, and Warwick himself was killed. Lady Margaret's husband, Sir Henry Stafford, fought on the Yorkist side, demonstrating how quickly this couple could change sides when it was necessary, and he was wounded. Meanwhile, that same day, Margaret of Anjou, her son, and her son's new wife, who was Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, arrived in England from France and heard what had happened. They tried to get to Wales to meet up with Jasper and the young Henry Tudor, But Edward IV caught up with them at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, and in the ensuing battle, Queen Margaret's 17-year-old son, Edward Prince of Wales, not to be confused with Edward IV's new son, who was given the same name and title, was killed. Margaret and Anne were taken prisoner, and Henry VI mysteriously died in the Tower on the 21st of May, supposedly on the spot marked on the floor here, though probably not really. And with that, the main Lancastrian line had been extinguished, and the Yorkist victory in the Wars of the Roses seemed unsurmountable. In the short term, this was a failure for Lady Margaret Beaufort, as it meant she was once again not a member of the extended royal family, and her son was now in grave danger. The 14-year-old Henry was now the senior surviving Lancastrian male, even despite the taint of illegitimacy and the legal bar on the throne stemming from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford's union. Until September 1471, he was holed up in Pembroke Castle with his uncle Jasper, and Margaret advised him not to accept any offer of a pardon from Edward IV, who was developing a reputation for breaking such promises when it suited him, and to instead flee abroad. The two Tudors did as she suggested and sailed for France that month, though they were blown off course and ended up in Brittany instead, which I know is part of modern-day France, but it was a little different in the 15th century. It was to be 14 years before Margaret saw her child or Jasper again. On the 4th of October that same year, her husband died too, having never properly recovered from the wounds he sustained at the Battle of Barnet. Margaret now faced a new chapter in her life, as she worked to survive in a hostile environment and promote her absent son's interests. The first thing she did was to remarry, and with immodest haste. Her new husband was Thomas Lord Stanley, a favourite of Edward IV's, whom the now 29-year-old Margaret wed in June 1472. It was a smart match, which offered the Lancastrian Margaret the protection of a Yorkist husband and a conduit to the king, whose trust and good graces she was going to need to secure if she ever wanted to build a bridge back to England for her son. For Stanley, it provided access to Margaret's considerable landholdings. Lady Margaret was now at the centre of York court life, and her biographers, Michael Jones and Malcolm Underwood, I'll leave details of their book in the description box, note that she was present and played a leading role in royal events like the reburial of the long-dead Duke of York, father of Edward IV, in 1476, and the christening of Princess Bridget in 1480. Always, though, she sought the rehabilitation of her son. In 1472, just before her marriage to Stanley, she made a will which allowed for some of her lands to be used to create an estate for Henry, should he ever return from exile, and her hopes must have been buoyed by the execution in 1478 of the king's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who was drowned in wine of all things, for this freed up the Earl of Richmond title once again. She was still cautious of Edward IV, though. In 1476, she told Henry not to return to England even if he was offered a York princess as a bride, which suggests that she was wary of Edward's plans, and in fact the king was hunting her son across the western continent, nearly catching him on more than one occasion, which would very possibly have led to Henry's death. See my video on his early life for details of his extraordinary journey to the throne, which I think is often overlooked by Tudor enthusiasts because they get distracted by Henry VIII and his wives and Elizabeth I. By 1482, the situation seemed to have improved though, for a document which Edward IV himself signed off on again made arrangements for Henry's return from exile, as long as he was in the king's favour. It did this by reaffirming the earlier grant of lands made back in 1472, and also assigned him many of the lands which had belonged to Margaret's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Somerset, who had only just died a few weeks earlier. The fact that the Richmond title was something the family wanted back for him is emphasised by the fact that the document actually referred to him as the Earl of Richmond, though in reality he hadn't held that title for many years. The 1482 plans never came to anything, probably because Henry Tudor was reluctant to trust Edward IV, and he was right to be so. Not only had Edward been hunting him down, the king was also making alternative arrangements for his daughters' marriages, and wasn't perhaps all that committed to a match between his eldest girl, Princess Elizabeth, and the sometime Lord Richmond. From Margaret's point of view, though, she was investigating and, where possible, setting up potential routes of return for her son, even if they didn't ultimately pan out. She was essentially keeping her own and his options open, but without actually committing to anything that might put Henry in physical danger. As it transpired, though, it was only by placing himself in the greatest possible physical danger that he would in fact get to come home, and the chain of events which led to his dramatic return all started in April 1483 when Edward IV died. In the next part of the video, we're going to look at that year's dramatic sequence of events and at the accusations that Margaret may have had something to do with the fate of Edward's sons, the princes in the Tower. After the older king's death, the succession initially seemed secure enough. The crown passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V, who was then at Ludlow Castle, where he was being raised by his mother's Woodville family, specifically Queen Elizabeth's brother, Anthony Woodville, and one of her sons from her first marriage, Richard Grey. He was quickly sent for to return to London for his coronation and left the castle on the 24th of April. Things started to go seriously awry, though, when Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, got involved. He intercepted the new king on the 29th of April, seized control of the boy's person, and ultimately had Woodville and Grey killed. He took the new little king to London, ostensibly to prepare for his coronation, placed him in the Tower, and had one of his staunch supporters, Lord Hastings, summarily executed. Then, on the 16th of June, he had the Dowager Queen, who had fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her daughters and younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, release this other boy into his care. The little Duke was sent straight to the Tower to join his brother, after which Gloucester announced that actually Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had never been legally married, their children were therefore illegitimate, and he was in fact the rightful king. He took the crown on the 26th of June, and the princes in the Tower, who were really a king and a prince, just to be precise, were never seen again. Now, my personal view is that those boys were most likely killed on Richard III's orders, but there is a theory, popularised in recent years by the novelist Philippa Gregory, that Margaret Beaufort somehow had them killed in order to clear a path to the throne for her son Henry Tudor. I've always found this to be a particularly bad case of pseudo-history and a terrible slander to lay at Margaret's door. What grates with me is not that Gregory put this baseless rumour into her fiction books, because fiction is fiction, and even when it's based on historical fact, you are allowed to play around with it, and I quite like that. What kind of a world would it be without the likes of Outlander and Doctor Who, for instance, giving us alternative histories? No, I really only take issue with the claims that Gregory's accusations that Margaret was a double child murderer are actually based on solid historical research and might be true. That is codswallop. We don't know for certain what happened to the boys, but all available circumstantial evidence points to Richard III as having orchestrated their disappearance and likely deaths. From his seizure of the children and the throne, to the murder of Anthony Woodville, Richard Grey and Lord Hastings, to the fact that they disappeared and he never produced them to show that they were still alive, nor did he comment on their fate or order any investigation into it, to the potential confession in the early 1500s of Sir James Tyrrell, who said he and two other men had smothered the boys on Richard's orders, to the discovery in 1674 of two skeletons behind a wall in the White Tower, which have long been assumed to be the princes and which are now interred in Westminster Abbey. There is absolutely no evidence that Margaret had anything to do with it, and huge practical problems associated with her planning it. How exactly was she, or rather her agents, supposed to have breached the walls of the Tower of London, for instance, had its two most high-profile guests/prisoners murdered, and got away with it? Furthermore, she didn't actually have a motive for killing them. It's only with hindsight that we can see that events were leading her son towards the throne at that point. No one knew that in 1483, and killing the boys at that stage only made Richard's position more secure, not Margaret's, as without them, he really was next in line for the throne. This is because the children of his older brother George had been blocked from it due to their father's disgrace and execution back in 1478. In fact, had she or anyone else killed them, it would have been a gift to Richard, who could have blamed their deaths on someone other than himself and removed the stain of being a regicide and child killer from himself. The fact that he never accused anyone else of having harmed them is very telling indeed. Lastly, had Margaret had the princes killed without her son in position to immediately take the throne, the most likely outcome would have been her own execution and an indelible blemish on Henry Tudor's reputation. Murdering them at that point would have been stupid and would still have left them with the problem of needing to kill Richard III and his son. We have to remember that the chances that Henry Tudor, an exiled Welshman from an illegitimate branch of the royal family, who was only the great-great-great-grandson of a long-dead king, was going to wind up on the throne in the near future were ludicrously low at this point. Richard held the crown. He had a legitimate son. The son of his brother George was still alive, even if he had been barred from the throne, and there was also the Duke of Buckingham to contend with. Despite being married to Elizabeth Woodville's sister, Buckingham was initially a strong supporter of Richard III, but as a descendant of Edward III's fifth son, Thomas of Woodstock, he also had his own claim on the throne. He was, by the by, also Margaret's nephew through her second marriage. Each of these people were in better shape to claim the throne than Henry Tudor. Even Edward IV's daughters were better potential claimants, despite their new illegitimate status, as was Lady Margaret Beaufort herself, who was, after all, the senior surviving Beaufort claimant, not her son. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Henry VII taking the crown was one of the big plot twists of English history, and it's not something his mother was even contemplating until late 1483. Up to that point, she was still angling, as she had been for years, for Henry to return as the Earl of Richmond, then hopefully marry one of the York princesses and live the life of a landed magnate. She even opened negotiations with the new Richard III in early July 1483 with a view to bringing that plan to fruition, and attended the coronation of Richard and his queen, Anne Neville, on the 6th or 7th of that month. Again, I've seen different sources give different dates. I know Margaret's reputation has been trashed in many quarters by those claiming that she was a grasping maniac who always had her eye on the throne, but if you're going to claim that, then please provide some actual evidence to support it, and which is strong enough to counteract all the evidence against Richard I've just gone through. Using historical hindsight to dream up what I consider to be a phony motive and offering no explanation as to how Margaret could have gotten someone into the Tower to commit this double murder isn't remotely convincing, and in fact the very real practical problems associated with trying to get at the princes were amply proven in late July 1483 when there was a failed plan to rescue them. This plan involved the Tudors inasmuch as letters were sent to Jasper and Henry telling them that parts of London would be set on fire as a distraction, then the princes would be taken out of the Tower, with the longer term plan seemingly being that the two Tudors would come back with an invasion force from France to support the restored Yorkist king, therefore confirming their loyalty to the regime. The attempt to storm the Tower failed, however. Scores of conspirators were arrested, several were executed, and the princes were never found. By September, the gossip in London and beyond was that they were most likely dead. It was only at this stage that Margaret began to plot to put her son on the throne. Her first attempt to do so, however, was a complete failure and nearly cost her her life. This attempt was made in the autumn of 1483, and one of Margaret's co-conspirators was none other than the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville, whose involvement indicates that she believed her royal sons were dead, and it also suggests that she didn't think that Margaret had anything to do with it. The new plan was that Henry Tudor would invade with a French army, take the throne, and marry Princess Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the two factions of the Plantagenet family. The two women communicated via their mutual doctor, Lewis Caerlyon, who was able to get in to see Elizabeth and her daughters who were still in sanctuary, and were assisted by other conspirators, including Elizabeth's last remaining son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, Marquess of Dorset, and her brothers, Richard, Edward, and Lionel, Bishop of Salisbury. More surprising is the involvement of the Duke of Buckingham, and to this day no satisfactory explanation has been found to explain why he turned on Richard in order to help Henry Tudor, but Jones and Underwood suggest that Margaret may have duped him into thinking that he would end up on the throne. His role was to raise an army in England which would join up with a force coming over from France under Henry's control. The entire thing was a disaster, however. Buckingham rebelled too soon, struggled to gain significant support, and ended up going into hiding. By the time Henry Tudor arrived off the Dorset coast, it was too late to do anything. He sailed back to Brittany, where he was joined in exile by Lord Dorset. Buckingham was captured and executed in Salisbury on the 2nd of November, and Lionel Woodville had to flee to Beaulieu, where he died the following year. As for Lady Margaret, she was lucky to escape with her life, and it was only her marriage to the pro-Ricardian Lord Stanley which saved her. She was stripped of her money and lands, including those she had placed in trust for Henry back in the 1470s, and these were instead given to her husband. As for her person, she was placed under house arrest in the custody of her spouse and without her household servants. Short of torturing or killing her, Richard could hardly have punished her more. She was still alive, though, and that was his mistake, for Lord Stanley allowed her to continue communicating with Henry, and less than 2 years later, she and her son made the comeback of the century. By August 1485, Richard III's position was markedly weaker in many ways. His wife had died, as had his only son, and only legitimate child in fact, and though this did leave him free to remarry and produce fresh heirs, he hadn't done so yet. He was the only real obstacle between Henry Tudor and the throne, and Henry's plan was clearly still to oust Richard and marry Elizabeth of York, a marriage which he swore to see through on Christmas Day 1483 in Rennes Cathedral in France. There was also little for Henry to lose now by trying to take the crown. He and his mother had shown their hands at the end of 1483, and I think they were both in a do-or-die situation. If Henry didn't take the throne, he'd be on the run for the rest of his life, and if he waited any longer, he ran the risk of Richard marrying again and producing those fresh heirs I mentioned. There were even rumours, which Richard denied, that he was going to marry his niece, Princess Elizabeth himself. It was time for the final Tudor push for the throne. Henry landed at Milford Haven on the 7th of August 1485 with a small army, which included Elizabeth Woodville's remaining brothers, Edward and Richard, though her son, Lord Dorset, had been left behind as a hostage to the French to make sure Henry paid them back the money they had given him towards this expedition. Marching through Wales and into England, Henry finally clashed with Richard's forces at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. Also at the battle was Margaret's husband, Thomas Lord Stanley, with his brother William. William's decision to throw his military might behind his step-nephew helped to swing matters in Henry's favour, while Thomas remained neutral, no doubt so that he could say he was on the side of whoever the winner was and intercede on William's behalf if needs be. This wasn't necessary in the event, though. Richard III was killed, and it was Thomas who picked up the deceased king's battle crown and placed it on Henry's head. The Tudor era had begun, and Margaret was now the mother of the king and the most powerful woman in the land. It was an extraordinary turnaround for a woman who had not been born the child of a monarch or a prince, who had effectively been sold off as a little girl not once but twice, who had survived childbirth at 13 and been separated from her son for 14 years, and who had to try to ingratiate herself with 3 separate kings, all whilst protecting her child's interests and trying to find a safe way to bring him home to her. Margaret's job wasn't over yet, though. With she and Henry's new positions came new responsibilities and new dangers. For getting the throne was one thing, while keeping it was entirely another. Make sure you come back next time to hear all about how she helped him to navigate his new position and her relationships with her one-time ally Elizabeth Woodville, her new daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York, and of course her infamous grandson, the future Henry VIII. Let me know below if I've convinced you that Margaret didn't have anything to do with the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and if you can't wait to hear more about the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors, try one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.